It's Franco Terrazzano, the Canadian director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. How's it going out there, Franco?
Corey, it's swampy here in the nation's swamp. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well, but I mean, even if I'm distant from the nation's swamp, I still get to pay the bills for it. So I might as well get you to come in and tell us what we're paying for this year. With the new budget and with April 1st hitting, we got all sorts of new stuff to look forward to funding, yeah?
Oh, we sure do. And you know what you're paying for? Higher member of parliament pay. Yep.
Oh, yes.
You heard that right, folks. April 1, the insult injury for taxpayers, because on the same day they take more money from your wallet, they stuffed more money into their own wallets. April 1, we saw alcohol taxes go up, the carbon tax go up, and members of parliament took their fourth pay raise since the beginning of the pandemic. Members of parliament, the raise was about $5,100 for a backbencher, all the way up to an extra $10,200 for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So look, these guys, a backbencher is making about $194,000 now. They don't need a raise, and they certainly don't deserve a raise.
Yeah, and you're going to pay a little more to try and drink and comfort yourself with it. I mean, I do want to point out, though, a bit of, I think, a taxpayer advocacy success story with that, in a sense, at least. I mean, damage was mitigated. The alcohol tax was supposed to go up a lot more than it did. And at least with some good lobbying from the breweries and others, the government did back off and bring it down to only 2%, I believe, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2%, a 2% increase. I mean, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and our supporters deserve a lot of credit here too, because they were emailing, they were calling, they were hammering these politicians, and we essentially forced them to back down from a 6.3% tax hike. You know, I know we'll get into the budget in a second here, but isn't it just sad that essentially the best thing in the budget for taxpayers was that the federal government wasn't going to hike its alcohol tax as much as it wanted? Right? It wanted to hike alcohol taxes by 6.3%. It ended up increasing taxes, but by 2%. So a little bit less. That'll save Canadian taxpayers millions of dollars. But here's the thing that your people need to know, Corey. Every time you go pick up that case of Canadian, you're paying about 50% in tax. You go pick up that bottle of Pinot to enjoy with your better half, you're paying about 65% of that bottle in wine. And every time you'd want to enjoy one of the hard stuff, like the whiskeys, the vodkas, and rum, you're already paying about 3/4 plus of that bottle in tax.
And that's it's quite a waste. And that puts a lot of pressure, and that's what some of the lobbying was. I just like to point out once in a while, it reminds people it's worth speaking up, though. You can make them back off a bit, because that was really harming the hospitality industry. I mean, as a former pub owner, I know those margins are narrow, and when you got to keep raising your prices, your customers don't respond well.
And Corey, let's remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. What just happened over the last 2+ years? I mean, our tourism sector, our small businesses, your favorite restaurant or pub or brewery down the road was absolutely hammered by government lockdowns. So it's not like these small businesses are just have buckets of cash lying around for the Trudeau government to continue to take more and more money from them. And of course, Canadians are tapped out as well. Now, Corey, let's talk about the big tax that everyone is going to be feeling, especially out there in your neck of the woods in Alberta, the carbon tax. It went up again April 1. It's going to cost the average Alberta family about $710 this year, even after the rebates. But Trudeau is going to continue cranking up that carbon tax all the way through to 2030. By 2030, the carbon tax will cost the average family about $2,700, even after the rebates. Absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, well, and that is a tax on everything. And I mean, that's one where there just hasn't been any success. We've been pushing back hard on that tax for years now, and the government's just determined to keep raising it and pushing forward with this tax. But I mean, something interesting that came out, I noticed, I mentioned Guilbeault earlier, one of my favorite people on Parliament Hill, but he kind of admitted, well, okay, so everybody's paying more than they're getting back, but it's mostly the rich. So, I mean, apparently this is a wealth redistribution tax rather than an environmental savior.
Corey, two things on that. Number one, a politician finally admitting what everyone already knew, right? If you think that you can raise taxes, skim some off the top to pay for some new bureaucrats, then somehow make everyone better off with rebates, then I've got some Ocean View property in Lethbridge to sell you. I mean, of course you can't do that. The parliamentary budget officer is showing that the government is using magic math to try to spin Canadians, right? As I just mentioned, from the parliamentary budget officer, itself, the carbon tax is costing the average Canadian the average family in Alberta $710 this year, even after rebates. That's a couple weeks of groceries for a struggling family that the government is taxing away. Now, Corey, let's talk about that redistribution. I've heard a lot in the news about a redistribution from the wealthy to the poor, but I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's largely correct. I think what we're actually seeing with the carbon tax is a redistribution from certain lifestyles to others, right? Because there's going to be a lot of rich people out there who live off of their computer, the Zoom class, who won't be paying as much in carbon tax as other Canadians who might be lower or middle class Canadians who may be mechanics, who might have to drive to work, right? Who have to heat their homes with natural gas. So I get the PBO's point, but I think what would be more accurate is to describe the carbon tax as punishing certain lifestyles while punishing other lifestyles even more.
Yeah, and it punishes them, but it doesn't change them, because if you're a mechanic who has to drive to the shop to work, it doesn't change no matter how high that carbon tax goes. Or if you own a home and you want to keep your family from freezing to death, you have to pay for energy products to heat your home. So it's not like it's something you can choose to escape.
Well, that's absolutely correct, right? I mean, people who have to drive to work have to put gasoline or diesel in their car. Truckers, by the way, who bring all of our food to the store, they have to fuel up their big rigs with diesel. So when you make it more expensive for a trucker to deliver the food to the store, you make it more expensive for families to buy that food at the store. Or what about farmers in Canada, right? Well, they need natural gas or propane to dry grain. Well, when you make it more expensive for farmers to produce the food, you also make it more expensive for families to buy the food. So now when we hear about the carbon tax, the government is essentially punishing you for the necessities in life. So what happens? Well, now families have less money in their pockets to pay for their kids' education, for example.
Yeah, it hits us on every level. I'm glad you guys continue to point that out. So we might as well get to the true giant elephant in the room, though, and that's that massive spending budget we got greeted with just a couple of weeks ago. I guess it wasn't that unexpected, but boy, it's ugly.
Oh, it's really ugly. So what is the government giving taxpayers? More debt, more deficits, and higher taxes forever, essentially. Look, I think with Budget 2023, it's safe to say that this government will never balance the budget. They'll just never balance the budget. Now, the one surprise is just how much they just don't care about fiscal responsibility or helping taxpayers. Because remember, before the budget, you had Freeland, who was essentially saying, well, don't worry, folks, this is going to be prudent. Even during the budget, she said she'd be exercising restraint. They'd be saving money. Corey, I don't know if these politicians understand this, but if you spend billions of dollars more every single year, if you increase spending by $85 billion over a handful of years, you're saving money wrong.
Well, yeah, we can't do it that way. I mean, that's some of that difference, right? I mean, they're living on the credit cards, but at the same time, also what they can do is just kind of keep cranking out that monetary supply. But then that leads to inflation and devaluation of our own currency. I mean, your average citizen, unfortunately, I think, doesn't pay enough attention to that. And, the government keeps pointing, it's the grocers that are messing with you or those greedy energy companies. Well, no, your dollar is buying less, and the government has a part in that.
Well, it also has a part in that with some of the groceries, too. Let's not forget that the Trudeau government announced $12 million for Loblaw, right? Like, let's not forget that the government continues to spend buckets of cash, raising taxes on Canadians, then handing buckets of cash to certain corporations. So let's not forget that. I mean, of course, we're against corporate welfare. Corey, I know you're against corporate welfare. You've held many politicians accountable on this show for corporate welfare, and kudos to you for that. But you're absolutely right. Two ways the government is driving up the cost of living, and including groceries. We talked about one way, the never-ending carbon tax hikes, right? You make it more expensive for farmers to make the food. You make it more expensive for families to buy the food. But then also, they make everything more expensive when they print money. The central bank printed hundreds of billions of dollars, more than $300 billion right out of thin air during the pandemic, largely by buying Government of Canada debt. That's using the printing press to finance Ottawa's out-of-control deficits. Now, the problem is the central bank can print dollars right out of thin air, but it can't print ground beef out of thin air. It can't print farmland out of thin air, and it can't print new condos out of thin air. So you get this situation where you have too many dollars chasing too few goods, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is the inflation tax.
Well, and then as we go farther down, we know what the Bank of Canada responds with, and we've seen that, is raising interest rates. And that affects things all the way down the line. And the other area of the biggest wasteful spending that drives me bananas to watch is interest servicing our federal debt. I mean, talk about flushing dollars down the toilet, and those numbers are getting staggering.
Staggering. You know, I can't believe we're going to see this, but by 2027, Corey, we're talking about $50 billion just to cover the interest charges on the federal government credit card. $50 billion 1 year on interest charges to cover the debt. Now, this year, interest charges are going to be pretty high, man. $44 billion, okay? That's a cost of $1,000 per person that we're not getting through better healthcare or, you know, better roads or lower taxes, because that money, guess where it's going? To the bond fund managers on Bay Street just to pay interest on the debt. And while we're talking about the debt, this year, the government's debt will pass $1.2 trillion. When Trudeau first came to power, the debt was about $616 billion, which means that over Trudeau's time, Trudeau will have nearly doubled the debt, the entire federal debt, by the end of this year.
Yeah, we can't maintain that spending trajectory much longer. I mean, things have to crash. But I'll throw as we get to the tail end of this, the harder part, though, how can we stop this? I mean, what can we do? What can the government cut? I mean, that's always the area to say, well, we're going to have to cut healthcare or policing or whatever if you want to cut any spending. But I think there's probably a few areas they could cut that really wouldn't hurt the common Canadian that much.
Yeah, like maybe stop giving yourself pay raises. Hey, that might help. I mean, look, we're so far away from even talking about the big things that you just mentioned because there is so much fat everywhere. I mean, you can barely walk downtown Ottawa without stepping on some government waste. Okay, like we talked about the pay raises. Here's one. Bureaucrats last year, isn't this nice? Gave themselves $200 million in bonuses when they can barely meet half of their own targets. Corey, if you go to Derek and you say, hey, I haven't met half of my own targets this year, give me a bonus check. He ain't going to give you a bonus check. He's going to give you a boot somewhere. Let me tell you that. Okay.
Oh, I got a pretty good idea where that goes.
Yeah. $6,000 a night in a hotel room. Cut that. You know, maybe stop giving beef Wellington and pork stuffed tenderloin to the governor general and their entourage every time they have to fly overseas. We talked about the bonuses for those bureaucrats. What about the pay raises on top of that, right? More than 300,000 federal government employees received at least one raise during the pandemic. We just got a PBO report out yesterday that shows that the cost to fund the bureaucracy increased by 31% over 2 years. We talked about Loblaws, right? The $12 million announced for them. What about the $295 million announced for the Ford Motor Company? What about the $372 million announced for Bombardier? We still don't know how many billions of dollars the government is giving to Volkswagen. So scrap the corporate welfare. I mean, there is so much fat in Ottawa's budget that it's almost difficult to know where to start to cut. But I've given you some examples there.
You certainly have, and I know we could keep you for an hour and you could list a lot more, but I do have to let you go. So before you take off, where can people find information from your organization and how they can help holding this government to account?
Guys, check out taxpayer.com. And hey, for everyone watching right now, please do me a favor. If you want to contact a member of parliament, pick up the phone, give them an email, and say, hey, why aren't you publicly speaking out against the pay raises? I would love to hear what they say to you.
Yeah, it's when it comes to their own wallets, it's amazing how quiet they get. Always great to have you on, Franco. Thanks for the work you're doing, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Take care, Corey.